Welcome to another tale of suspense and unease, where the ordinary transforms into something far more unsettling. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on our next eerie story. And if you're already a part of this community, well, welcome back. I'm glad you're here to join me once again in a journey through the unknown. It was an ordinary evening when Jake found himself at the counter of his small, dimly lit apartment. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic tapping of his fingers against the countertop were the only sounds breaking the silence. His apartment was cozy, almost comforting in its simplicity. Nothing too extravagant, just the essentials: a couch, a small kitchen area, and the ever-growing pile of pizza boxes stacked in the corner. He wasn't a fan of cooking, and pizza was always his go-to option after a long day at work. It was a routine he'd grown comfortable with. Tonight was no different. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the passing time as Jake scrolled through his phone, debating between ordering the usual pepperoni or trying something new. It wasn't until he heard the faint buzz of his phone vibrating on the counter that his attention was diverted. A text message. "Hey Jake, you good for the usual pizza order tonight?" It was his friend and roommate Mark asking if he wanted the usual. Mark wasn't home at the moment. He'd been out for a few days, visiting family, but they often shared the same pizza order when he was around. Jake smiled and quickly typed a response. "Yeah, sounds good. Same order as always. I'll call them in a bit." After sending the message, Jake dialed the familiar number of the local pizza place, the one he had ordered from for years. The phone rang once, then twice, before a voice on the other end answered. "Good evening, Pizza Hut. How can I help you?" "Hey, it's Jake. Same order as usual. Pepperoni, extra cheese," Jake said, his voice relaxed and easy. "Of course, Jake, the usual. It'll be delivered in about 30 minutes. Anything else for you tonight?" "No, that's all. Thanks." He hung up, set the phone down, and leaned back against the counter, tapping his fingers lightly on the edge. As the minutes passed, he absent-mindedly stared out the window, watching the street lights flicker in the distance. It was a quiet night, the kind that made everything seem calm, almost too calm. A sudden noise from the hallway jolted him out of his thoughts, a muffled thud, like something had fallen. He frowned, standing up and walking toward the door. He paused for a moment, wondering if he should investigate, but then dismissed the thought. It was probably just a neighbor, nothing to worry about. He had been feeling a bit more jumpy than usual lately, and he couldn't quite place why. With a shake of his head, he returned to the couch, settling in and pulling the blanket around him. The sound of the refrigerator kicking on broke the silence again, and Jake's gaze drifted back to the window. It was strange how something as simple as the ticking of the clock or the hum of appliances could feel so loud when everything else was so still. As the minutes ticked by, his thoughts drifted to the last time he'd felt truly comfortable. It had been before everything started to feel off. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was a lingering unease that had started to creep in, slowly but surely. It had started with small things: a missing key, a door slightly ajar when he was sure he had closed it, things that made him question whether his mind was playing tricks on him. Ding dong. The doorbell rang, breaking his thoughts. Jake stood up, relieved that the pizza had finally arrived. He walked to the door, wiping his palms on his jeans, as a strange tension began to rise in his chest. It wasn't the delivery that was causing it. No, it was something else. Something he couldn't quite explain. When he opened the door, he was greeted by a figure in a delivery uniform, holding a pizza box. The man's face was obscured by a mask, but it was the strange look in his eyes that caught Jake off guard. There was something unsettling about them, a coldness that sent a shiver down Jake's spine. "Your pizza," the man said in a flat tone, extending the box toward him. Jake took it, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over him. "Thanks," he muttered, handing over the cash. The man didn't say anything else, just turned and walked away without a word. Jake stood there for a moment, watching the delivery man retreat into the night. The quiet stillness of the moment felt wrong. Something about it just didn't sit right with him. As he closed the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He let out a shaky breath, trying to convince himself it was nothing, just a delivery. But deep down, something told him this night was going to be anything but ordinary. The apartment felt oddly suffocating after the delivery. Jake tried to brush it off, focusing on the pizza box resting on the counter, its scent drifting through the air. He was hungry, and pizza had always been a comfort, something familiar and easy to consume after a long day. Yet, the feeling of unease hadn't left him. As he pulled the pizza from its box, the warmth of the cheese and the crispy crust was inviting, but it couldn't shake the nagging sensation at the back of his mind. The delivery man's eyes, cold and distant, lingered in his thoughts. Sitting at the counter, Jake tried to focus on the simple act of eating. He took a bite, the familiar taste of pepperoni and cheese flooding his senses. For a moment, it was just him, the pizza, and the quiet hum of the apartment. But then, a faint sound reached his ears, a soft tapping, like a knock on the wall. He froze. The tap came again, louder this time. His gaze shot to the hallway where the sound seemed to be coming from. He swallowed the bite in his mouth, unsure whether he had heard it at all or if it was just his imagination. He got up slowly, moving cautiously toward the source of the noise. Nothing. Jake stood in the hallway for a moment, listening intently. It was silent again, save for the faint ticking of the clock in the living room. He shook his head, convinced it was just the house settling, some natural noise that occurred when the temperature dropped. But the unease wouldn't leave him. He walked back to the kitchen, sat down, and tried to focus on his pizza again. The doorbell rang. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected anyone else, especially not at this hour. It was late. Too late for anyone to be visiting. His first instinct was to ignore it. He could just pretend he hadn't heard it. Let whoever it was leave. But something made him stand up and move toward the door, a strange compulsion he couldn't explain. When he opened the door, no one was there. He glanced down at the ground, half expecting to see a package or something left behind. But there was nothing. No delivery, no sign of anyone having been there at all. The street outside was empty. The only sound, the distant hum of cars passing by. "Hi!" Jake's mind raced. What was going on? Was it possible he was just imagining things? He closed the door slowly, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He turned back to the kitchen, but the moment he stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop. His breath fogged in the air, and he shivered involuntarily. It wasn't cold enough for this. Not at all. Jake grabbed his phone, thinking of calling Mark, but then hesitated. He didn't want to sound paranoid. Besides, Mark had been away for a few days now, and Jake didn't want to worry him over nothing. As he set the phone down, he noticed something strange. The pizza was gone. The text message comes in regularly. It wasn't on the counter anymore. The box, which had only been opened moments ago, was now completely empty. Jake's stomach churned. Had he eaten it all without realizing? He checked the box, flipping it over, but there was no sign of any leftover slices. It was as though it had never been there at all. He couldn't explain it. There was no logical reason for the pizza to have vanished like that. The room felt heavier now, the shadows darker and the air colder. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the room, half expecting something or someone to appear. Then he noticed something even stranger. On the kitchen table, right next to where the pizza had been, was a note. a small, crumpled piece of paper, as though it had been left in a hurry. Jake hesitated, but his curiosity got the better of him. He reached out, unfolding the paper carefully. The message was short, handwritten in a messy scrawl. "I see you." His breath caught in his throat. A chill ran down his spine as he stared at the words, his mind struggling to make sense of it. Who had written this? How had it ended up here? Before he could gather his thoughts, the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then the power cut out entirely. The apartment was plunged into darkness. Jake's pulse quickened as he fumbled for his phone, the only light source in the room. His fingers trembled as he turned on the flashlight. The small beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the familiar objects in his apartment. But now, everything felt wrong. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, the corners of the room darker than they should be. Then he heard it. A soft whisper, like a voice coming from somewhere close by. "Right?" The voice was low, almost a breath, but it was unmistakable. His name. He spun around, the flashlight beam dancing across the walls. But there was no one there. "Jake." The voice came again, this time from behind him. His heart raced as he spun around once more, the flashlight shaking in his grip. There was still no one, just the emptiness of his apartment. Then the lights flickered back on, their sudden brightness blinding him for a moment. When his vision cleared, the note was gone. He stared at the empty space where it had been just seconds before. His hands trembled as he looked around, trying to process what had just happened. The fear was overwhelming, and the room seemed to close in on him. He could feel his heart thudding in his chest, each beat echoing in the silence. There was no logical explanation. The note, the whispering voice, the sudden coldness, none of it made sense. But as the clock ticked on, the sense of dread only grew. Jake stood in the middle of his kitchen, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the suffocating silence. His heart pounded in his chest, the echo of his name still lingering in his ears, even though he hadn't heard it again. The note had vanished, as if it had never existed, and yet its presence still haunted him. He reached out for his phone, needing something familiar to ground him. But when his fingers brushed the screen, he froze. There was a message. It was from an unknown number, the message itself short and cryptic. "You've been chosen." His blood ran cold. He stared at the screen, unable to look away. What did it mean? What was happening to him? The words felt like a direct threat, as if someone was watching him, waiting for something to happen. He glanced around the apartment again, as if expecting to see something, or someone, waiting in the shadows. The walls felt closer now, the air thick with an unsettling tension. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, even though there was no one else in the apartment. Jake walked back to the living room, hoping the change of scenery would help calm his nerves. He collapsed onto the couch, trying to breathe deeply, to push the growing anxiety away. His phone buzzed again, and his hands shot out to grab it, his mind racing. Another message. This one, though, was different. "You're not alone." Jake's stomach twisted. The words were simple, but they carried an undeniable weight, a chilling finality to them. He set the phone down beside him, trying to focus on the reality in front of him. He was alone in his apartment. No one had been here but him. There was no way anyone could have snuck in without him noticing. But as he sat there, something changed in the air. The apartment, once familiar and comforting, now felt foreign. The shadows seemed deeper, more oppressive. The light from the street lamp outside cast strange, elongated shapes through the blinds, twisting the world into something unrecognizable. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the kitchen, sharp and sudden, like something had been dropped. Jake jumped, his pulse racing again. He stood up, his body frozen with dread. The kitchen was silent now, but the noise had been unmistakable. It had come from somewhere inside, not from outside. Taking a slow, hesitant step toward the kitchen, Jake's mind screamed at him to stop, but his feet moved on their own, each step heavier than the last. As he reached the threshold of the kitchen, he saw it, a chair, knocked over in the middle of the room, as if someone had been sitting there and suddenly stood up, rushing away. He took another step forward, his breath shallow, his pulse quickening. There was no one there. The room was empty, just like it had been before. But the chair hadn't been there before. He was sure of it. He would have remembered. A cold gust of wind brushed against his skin, and Jake whipped around, his eyes searching for the source. The window was closed, locked tight. There was no breeze, no reason for the air to be so cold. And yet, it felt as though the temperature had dropped by several degrees in the span of a few seconds. Then his phone buzzed again. This time, the screen displayed a new message. "And now, let's talk about exercise. It's already begun." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. What had begun? What was happening to him? Jake felt a tightness in his chest, his breath becoming more erratic as the room seemed to close in around him. The walls felt like they were pressing in, suffocating him, and he had to get out. Without thinking, he grabbed his jacket and rushed toward the door, desperate for air, for escape. He couldn't stay here. Not anymore. The walls were too tight, the shadows too dark, and the messages, those haunting messages, they wouldn't stop. But as his hand touched the doorknob, something stopped him. Oh! The apartment was eerily quiet. The outside world was silent, as though the whole neighborhood had been swallowed by a heavy fog. His fingers hovered over the doorknob, but he couldn't bring himself to turn it. It was as if the door was no longer a simple exit. It had become a barrier, a threshold he wasn't sure he could cross. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, slow and deliberate. Marley. Jake's breath hitched. He turned, his eyes scanning the darkened corridor, but there was no one there. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but the hallway remained empty. His heart pounded in his chest as he took a step back, his hand gripping the doorknob tighter. Then the whisper came again. "Jake." This time it was right behind him. The voice was close. Too close. He spun around, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but once again, there was no one. One by one, the room felt like it was closing in on him. The air was thick, suffocating. His pulse raced, his mind spinning in circles. What was happening? What was going on? Jake's eyes landed on the kitchen table again, where the note had been earlier. He had almost forgotten about it, but now it seemed important. He had to know what it meant. What did it all mean? As he stepped back into the kitchen, he froze. There, sitting in the middle of the table, was the pizza box, the one he had thrown away, the one that had disappeared, and it was open. Jake's stomach lurched, and his legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed onto the floor, his hands trembling as he reached for the box. He had to know. He had to see what was inside. When he opened the box, the pizza was gone. But there at the bottom of the box was a note. It was the same handwriting. "It's time to pay." Jake's fingers trembled as he stared at the note, his heart racing in his chest. The words seemed to mock him, as though they were written specifically for him, designed to make him question everything he knew. It's time to pay. Huh? What did it mean? What had he done to deserve this? His breath was shallow, his thoughts scattered. The room around him seemed to close in tighter with every passing second, the air heavy and thick with dread. He was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to escape the suffocating grip of fear that had taken hold of him. The pizza box, once a harmless delivery, now felt like a cursed object. Jake pushed it away from him, as if the very act of touching it would pull him deeper into whatever nightmare he was being dragged into. His eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement, any indication that something, or someone, was there. But there was nothing. The apartment was silent, eerily so. Jake stood up slowly, his legs weak beneath him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The messages, the footsteps, the whispers. It was all too much. His rational mind screamed at him to call the police, to get help, but a deeper, more primal fear held him back. What if the police couldn't help? What if whatever was happening was beyond their understanding? What if the only thing he could do was run? He glanced toward the door again. It felt like the only escape, the only way out. But the door, just like the rest of the apartment, seemed to be mocking him. He knew he had to leave, but the thought of stepping outside into the unknown, into whatever waited for him, filled him with dread. Jake took a deep breath and grabbed his jacket, slipping it on with shaky hands. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he couldn't stay here any longer. The apartment, once his sanctuary, had become a prison. The walls seemed to press in on him, the air thick with an oppressive energy that made his skin crawl. Now, as he moved toward the door, he stopped suddenly, his hand hovering over the knob. The footsteps. They were closer now, growing louder, as if someone, or something, was right outside, waiting for him to make his move. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the darkened hallway. But there was nothing there, just the oppressive silence. But then something caught his eye. The window. The blinds were drawn shut, but the faintest sliver of light leaked through, casting a strange, distorted shadow across the floor. Jake stepped closer, his heart hammering in his chest. The light seemed wrong, unnatural, like something was out of place. He reached out, his fingers brushing the blinds, and the room seemed to hold its breath. He pulled the blinds open with a quick motion, his eyes squinting against the bright light outside. But what he saw made his stomach drop. The street was empty. No cars, no people, nothing. But there, in the distance, standing at the far end of the street, was a figure. A man. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The figure was motionless, standing perfectly still, as though waiting for him to notice. The man was dressed in black, his face obscured by a dark hood, but it was the way he stood that sent a chill down Jake's spine. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even seem to breathe. It was as though he was a part of the night itself, blending into the shadows. Jake took a step back, his mind racing. Was this the person who had been sending the messages? Was this the person behind all of this? He didn't know, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't stay here. Not now. Not with that figure watching him from the street. He turned away from the window, his breath coming faster now, his chest tightening. The door. He had to leave, but as he reached for the doorknob, a cold, sharp voice rang out from the hallway, freezing him in place. Jake. It was the same voice from before, the one that had whispered his name. But this time, it was different. It was louder, clearer, more insistent. And it was coming from right behind him. Jake spun around, his heart racing, but once again, there was no one there. The hallway was empty, the silence deafening. He could feel his pulse in his throat, his hands clammy with sweat. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in on him. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't escape the suffocating sense of dread that seemed to be swallowing him whole. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling as he unlocked it. Maybe there was something he had missed, something he hadn't seen before. But when he opened his messages, his blood ran cold. There was a new message, from the same unknown number. It's already too late. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had no idea what was happening, but he could feel it now. He was being watched. Whatever this was, whatever force had taken hold of him, it wasn't just in his apartment. It was everywhere. It was closing in on him. Jake's hands shook as he stared at the message. He had to leave. He had to get out of here. But as he turned toward the door, something caught his eye. A shadow moving at the edge of his vision. It was him again, the figure. But this time he wasn't standing still. He was moving, slowly, deliberately, like a predator stalking its prey. Jake's breath hitched in his throat. He wasn't alone anymore. Jake's heart raced as the figure in the distance took another step forward, his movements slow but deliberate. Each step echoed in Jake's mind, each one sending a jolt of panic through his veins. He had to leave. He had to escape, but no matter where he looked, the walls seemed to close in tighter. The door, the window, they all felt like traps now, as if whatever was outside was just waiting for him to make a move. He stood frozen, unable to tear his gaze away from the figure who now walked with purpose, closing the distance between them. The man's movements were unnervingly smooth, like he was gliding over the pavement rather than walking. His black cloak billowed slightly in the wind, but it was his face, or rather the absence of it, that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. There was no face, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just an empty void where a person's features should be. It was as if the figure wasn't even human, as if it was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist. Something that shouldn't. Jake's mind raced. Could he outrun it? Should he try to call for help? No, the streets were empty. He knew no one would come. And even if they did, what could they do against something like this? The whispering voice from before returned, louder this time, as if it was coming from inside his own mind. "It's already too late, Jake. You should have stayed away." He clenched his fists, trying to push the voice out of his head. The fear was overwhelming, but he couldn't let it consume him. Not now. Not when he was so close to the truth. There had to be an answer. There had to be a way out of this nightmare. The figure was closer now, no more than a few steps away from the entrance of his building. Jake's legs trembled beneath him, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his body wouldn't obey. He could feel the weight of the figure's presence, even though it was still too far away to touch him. It was like a dark cloud had descended on the street, blocking out the light, making everything feel wrong. Jake backed away from the door, his eyes never leaving the figure as it continued its slow, purposeful advance. The man was now standing at the foot of the stairs leading to the building's entrance. He didn't move, didn't blink. He simply stood there, waiting. The air was thick with tension. Every breath felt like it could be his last. Jake's pulse pounded in his ears as he reached for his phone again, desperate for something to hold on to, something that could make sense of the chaos. But as he unlocked the screen, his heart sank. "Hell is in the details, Lemonhauer." Another message. "There's nowhere to run." Jake's hands shook as he dropped the phone, the screen shattering upon impact with the floor. It felt like the last shred of hope had slipped away with it. The figure was so close now that Jake could hear the faintest sound of footsteps on the pavement. The sound was muffled, as though it was coming from under the earth itself, from a place far darker than the world Jake knew. His legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor. Panic gripped him, tightening like a vice around his chest. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't escape the nightmare that was unfolding around him. "Damn you," he muttered, and opened his eyes to see Tar killing Camilla. "You should have stayed away." The voice was inside his head now, filling every corner of his mind, echoing with a cruel, mocking tone. Jake looked up, and his breath caught in his throat. The figure was standing in front of him now, its faceless void staring down at him, its presence suffocating, consuming. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, as though waiting for something. Waiting for him to understand. "Will," Jake managed to choke out, his voice trembling with fear. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached out a hand, slow and deliberate, as though savoring the moment. The air around Jake seemed to freeze, the temperature dropping so quickly that his breath turned to mist in front of him. The shadowy hand hovered inches from his face, and Jake felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him. He wanted to scream, to fight, to run, but his body was frozen in place. He couldn't move. He couldn't even blink. The hand finally touched his cheek, and the moment it did, Jake felt a cold, bone-chilling sensation flood his entire body. It was like being submerged in ice water, every muscle locking up, every thought slipping away. His vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he saw the faintest glimmer of something behind the faceless void. A flicker of light, a spark of recognition. But before he could process it, the figure pulled its hand away, and the coldness vanished as quickly as it had come. Jake gasped for air, his body trembling uncontrollably. His mind was a haze, every thought jumbled, as if he had just woken from a nightmare. But the figure was still there, standing in front of him, waiting. "Be time to pay," the voice whispered again, this time clear and sharp, like a blade slicing through the fog in Jake's mind. Jake didn't understand. What did it mean? What did he owe? What had he done to deserve this? The figure raised its hand again, but this time it wasn't for Jake. It was for something else. The air around them seemed to crackle with energy, and Jake's heart skipped a beat as he realized what was happening. It wasn't just him the figure was after. It was everything. Jake's mind spun in confusion, his pulse racing as the figure raised its hand once again. He couldn't process what was happening, couldn't make sense of the terrifying reality unfolding around him. The air had grown colder, heavier, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The figure's hand moved slowly through the air, and Jake's body tensed in fear. He wanted to scream, to run, but the fear was so overwhelming that he couldn't even move. His limbs felt like they were frozen in place, each second stretching into an eternity. Then the figure spoke, its voice like a distant echo, resonating in Jake's chest. "You've disturbed the balance, Jake." Jake's heart stopped. Disturbed the balance? What did that mean? What had he done? "The price must be paid," the voice continued, growing louder, more forceful. "You sought the forbidden, and now it's time to face the consequences." Jake tried to speak, but his throat was tight, constricted. His mind was a blur, full of questions that had no answers. He had no idea what the figure was talking about. The pizza delivery? The strange messages? Had he been part of something bigger? Something that had been set in motion long before he ever picked up the phone that night? "There is no escape," the figure whispered. And for the first time, Jake saw something in the empty void where its face should have been. A flicker, a hint of something darker, something far older than anything Jake could comprehend. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, as if reality itself was warping. Jake felt his heart hammer in his chest as the shadows around him grew thicker, pressing in on him from all sides. The walls of the apartment seemed to bend and twist, the ceiling stretching and distorting, as though the world itself was unraveling. Suddenly a loud crack echoed through the room, followed by a rush of air that sent Jake sprawling to the floor. He gasped for breath, his body shaking uncontrollably as the temperature dropped even further, turning the air into a biting cold that pierced through him. "No," Jake managed to whisper, his voice trembling. "This can't be real. This isn't happening." But the figure's presence was undeniable. It loomed over him, casting a long, dark shadow that seemed to stretch endlessly across the room. The void, where its face should have been, grew darker, more oppressive, as if it was pulling Jake into it. And then, as if it had heard his thoughts, the figure reached down and grabbed him by the wrist, its grip like iron, cold and unyielding. Jake's skin burned where it touched, a searing cold that seemed to sink deep into his bones. "You're not alone in this, Jake," the figure whispered, its voice now a low, guttural growl. "You're just one part of something much larger. You've opened the door, and now you'll have to face what's on the other side." Jake's vision blurred, his mind struggling to grasp the full weight of the figure's words. What did it mean? What had he done? His thoughts were a tangled mess, each one slipping away as soon as it appeared. The figure pulled him closer, and Jake's body felt like it was being dragged into a void, a place beyond time and space. His body screamed in protest, but he couldn't fight it. The figure's grip was too strong, its presence too overwhelming. The darkness around him deepened, swallowing everything in sight. The world he knew, the apartment, the street outside, everything, began to fade away, replaced by an endless abyss. There was no up, no down, no sense of direction, just an infinite, crushing darkness that seemed to stretch forever. And then, as if from the depths of the void, a voice spoke, low and resonant. "You've crossed the threshold, Jake. Now you must face the consequences," Raps said. The words were like a death sentence, echoing in his mind. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he tried to make sense of what was happening, but there was no time, no space for understanding. Everything was spinning. Everything was slipping away. He reached out, his hands trembling, desperate for something, anything to hold on to. But there was nothing, just the cold, empty void that seemed to consume him from all sides. And then, as quickly as it had started, the darkness began to recede. The coldness faded, and the oppressive weight lifted. He looked around, disoriented. He was back in the apartment, but it was different now. The walls were cracked, the furniture overturned. The place looked abandoned, decayed, as if time had moved forward in a way that didn't make sense. The figure was gone, but Jake could still feel its presence, lingering in the air like a shadow. And then, a sudden realization hit him. He was on the bottom rung. He wasn't alone. From the corner of the room, a figure stepped forward. A man, tall and thin, his face obscured by a hood. Jake's heart skipped a beat as the man approached, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The man stopped just in front of him, and Jake could feel his gaze, even though the man's face remained hidden. "You've come to understand," the man said, his voice low and smooth. "But it's too late for answers now. The price has already been paid." Jason's mind raced. What price? What had he done? And then, with a sudden movement, the man reached up and pulled back his hood, revealing his face. Jake's blood ran cold. It was him. The delivery boy. The one who had disappeared. Jake's mind reeled, the blood draining from his face as the delivery boy's familiar features stared back at him, twisted into something unrecognizable. The once cheerful, wide-eyed face was now gaunt and hollow, like the remnants of someone who had been lost to time. His eyes were empty, two dark voids that seemed to pull Jake in. The air around them thickened, a suffocating pressure closing in as the figure of the delivery boy, no, the man, stepped closer. Jake took a shaky step back, his legs trembling beneath him, but his body refused to obey. It was as if the very air was holding him in place, forcing him to stand face to face with the thing he feared most. "It's not possible," Jake whispered, his voice cracking. He had seen the boy disappear. He had watched him vanish into thin air like a ghost. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. But the man's cold smile only deepened, and his voice, once so warm and friendly, was now low and chilling. "Oh, it's real, Jake. Everything you've seen, everything you've experienced. It's all part of the plan." Jake's breath hitched in his throat as he tried to process the words. The plan? What plan? What had he gotten himself into? He had just been delivering pizzas, following the routine, never suspecting that something so sinister lurked beneath the surface. The pizza, the man continued, his voice taking on a mocking tone. The one you delivered that night. It was more than just food. It was the catalyst, the door you opened. And now there's no going back. Jake's stomach churned, nausea rising in his chest as the truth began to settle over him like a heavy fog. The pizza had been a trap. The delivery, the strange messages, the haunting dreams. It had all been part of a much larger scheme. But what was the scheme? Who was behind it? The man seemed to sense Jake's confusion, his grin widening as if enjoying the torment. You're not the first to come this far, Jake. There've been others before you, and there will be others after. You're just another piece in the puzzle, another step in the ritual. Ritual? The word echoed in Jake's mind, a chilling whisper that made his skin crawl. He had been part of something far darker than he had ever imagined. But what kind of ritual could it be? What kind of price was being paid? Before Jake could ask, the man raised his hand, his fingers twisting in the air like he was conducting an unseen force. The temperature in the room plummeted again, and Jake could see his breath rising in white puffs of cold air. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the once familiar apartment now felt like a prison, a suffocating cage where there was no escape. The man stepped forward, his presence overwhelming, as if the very essence of darkness had taken form in him. You were chosen, Jake. Chosen to carry the burden. Chosen to witness the final act of the ritual. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the room around him began to twist once more. The shadows seemed to reach for him, stretching and contorting like hands made of darkness, pulling him in. He could feel the pull, the invisible force trying to drag him into the depths. "Oh!" Jake screamed, finally finding his voice. He struggled against the darkness, pushing back with all his might. But it was no use. The shadows were too strong. The weight of the ritual, the weight of the consequences, was too heavy. The man's voice, low and eerie, cut through the chaos. "It's too late for you, Jake. The ritual is complete. You've been marked, and now you belong to it. There's no escape from the path you've walked." Jake's body was no longer his own. His arms and legs felt numb, as though they had been taken over by something far greater, far more ancient than anything he could comprehend. The shadows closed in around him, swallowing him whole, until he was consumed by the void. And then, as if from a great distance, Jake heard a faint sound, a voice, calling out to him. "Jake, wake up. Jake, wake up. Wake up. Wake up. Wake up." The voice was distant, echoing through the void, but it was familiar, a voice he hadn't heard in what felt like a lifetime. "Wake up, Jake." With all the strength he had left, Jake fought to hold on to the voice. It was his last thread of hope, the last connection to the world he once knew. He grasped at it, pulling himself forward, through the shadows, through the darkness. And then, with a sudden jolt, Jake opened his eyes. He was back in his apartment, gasping for air, his body drenched in sweat. The cold was gone, the shadows were gone. Everything was normal. "He's ghosts." For a moment he just lay there, panting, his heart racing. It had all been a dream, a nightmare. He was safe. He was home. But then, as he sat up, his eyes fell on the pizza box lying on the floor. It was the same box, the same pizza, the same delivery. The words from the man echoed in his mind, and Jake's blood ran cold once more. "The ritual is complete." Jake sat frozen, his eyes fixed on the pizza box, the weight of the man's words pressing down on him. He could feel his pulse racing, his hands trembling, The air in the room was still, unnaturally still, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that it wasn't over, that whatever he had experienced, the darkness, the shadows, the man, wasn't just a dream. It had been real, and now he was caught in its grip. The pizza box lay there, innocently enough, as if mocking him. It was just a box, wasn't it? Just a delivery. But Jake couldn't bring himself to touch it, couldn't bring himself to even get close to it. He could feel the pull of it, like a magnetic force, drawing him in. The man had said it. The ritual was complete. But what did that mean for him? What was the cost of the ritual? He needed answers. He needed to know if he was still trapped in whatever twisted reality he had been thrown into. Was he still a part of the ritual? Was he doomed to be consumed by it? As he sat there, staring at the pizza, a sudden noise from the kitchen broke his concentration. A soft, almost imperceptible scratching sound. Jake's heart leapt into his throat. His first instinct was to ignore it, to chalk it up to the paranoia that had been eating at him since the delivery. But something told him that he couldn't. He couldn't afford to ignore anything now. Slowly he stood up, his legs unsteady beneath him. The room felt smaller, more suffocating, as he walked toward the kitchen. The scratching sound grew louder, more urgent, as if something, or someone, was trying to get out. Steele and Andrew caught a glimpse of him. He reached the kitchen doorway and stopped dead in his tracks. There, in the middle of the floor, was a figure. A shadow. The same shadow that had followed him, that had tormented him in his dreams. The figure was crouched low, its hands clawing at the floor, its back hunched in a grotesque manner. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he realized with horror that the figure was no longer just a shadow. It was solid. It had substance. It was real. The figure lifted its head, and Jake's stomach turned. The face was the same one he had seen before. The delivery boy's face, twisted and distorted beyond recognition. His eyes were wide, empty, like two gaping holes where life had once been. His lips were pulled back in a grotesque smile, showing teeth that were sharp, jagged, like those of some kind of predator. The man's voice, low and gravelly, filled the silence. "You shouldn't have opened the door, Jake. You shouldn't have let me in." Jake's mind raced, his heart hammering in his chest. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. But as he stood there, frozen in place, the figure stood up slowly, its movements unnatural and jerky, like a puppet with broken strings. Finally, "It's too late now," the figure continued, its voice dripping with malice. "You've invited me in, and now I'm here to stay. Forever." Jake's body shook with fear, his legs barely holding him up. He wanted to run, to escape, but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The shadows seemed to stretch out from the figure, swirling around the room, closing in on him, tightening like a noose. The man's smile widened, revealing more of those sharp teeth. "You can't run from this, Jake. Your mind now. All of you. Your soul. Your mind. Everything." Suddenly, the air in the room grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that Jake could see his breath misting in front of him. His skin prickled with ice, his entire body shuddering, as if the cold was seeping into his very bones. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The figure froze. Its smile still stretched across its face, but its body went rigid. The shadows retreated, vanishing into the corners of the room. The temperature returned to normal, and the figure for the bearer boy was gone. The kitchen was empty once more.
"Yes?"
Jake stood there, his heart still pounding, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His legs gave way, and he collapsed to the floor, his back against the wall. He didn't know what was real anymore. He didn't know what to believe. Had it all been a nightmare? Had he imagined the whole thing? Or was this really happening? As he sat there, trying to make sense of it all, his eyes once again fell on the pizza box on the floor. The sight of it made his stomach churn, a deep sense of dread washing over him. He had to get rid of it. He had to destroy it before it could claim him completely. But before he could move, the phone rang. Jake's blood ran cold. He hadn't heard the phone ring in hours. Who could be calling at this time of night? He hesitated, his mind racing, but something compelled him to pick it up, to answer. With trembling hands, he reached for the phone. Jake's breath caught in his throat as the line went dead. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake was alone again, but the fear lingered, heavier than ever. He wasn't safe. He hadn't escaped, and the ritual wasn't finished. Jake's fingers trembled as he slowly placed the phone back down, the cold plastic pressing against his palm. The line had gone dead. The voice, familiar yet distorted, still echoed in his mind, leaving behind a sickening sense of dread. It's not over yet. He couldn't shake the feeling that the voice wasn't just a prank. It had been too clear, too deliberate. It wasn't just some wrong number or malfunction. The tone, the way it had whispered his name. It was as if someone, something, was watching him. Someone who knew him far too well. He rose from the floor, his legs unsteady, as though the room was spinning. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to leave, to run, far away from this house, from this nightmare. But he couldn't. It was as if some invisible force was holding him in place, keeping him tethered to the dark reality he was now a part of. He glanced back at the pizza box. The sight of it filled him with revulsion, yet there was something else there too, something compelling, like a strange pull he couldn't explain. His mind screamed at him to destroy it, to burn it, to rid himself of the evil that seemed to have come with it. But his body refused to move. Get rid of it, he thought. Just get rid of it. But the words seemed to bounce off him, falling into the abyss of his fear. With great effort, Jake managed to take a step forward. His body was shaking as he reached for the box. The second his fingers brushed the cardboard, a sudden chill ran down his spine. The temperature in the room plummeted once again, and a whisper, almost inaudible, slithered through the air. You can't escape. The voice seemed to come from all around him, the walls, the floor, the very air. It surrounded him, suffocating him, making him feel like he was drowning in a sea of whispers. It also escaped his mind now that Priya was here. He recoiled, dropping the pizza box as if it had burned him. His breathing became ragged, shallow, as his pulse quickened. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold, his mind racing. He had to think. He had to do something. His eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for an answer, for a way out. But there was nothing, just the walls closing in around him. The darkness that had crept into the corners of the room seemed to grow stronger, more alive, as if it was waiting for him to make the wrong move. Sweat had broken out on Landon's forehead, and his temper seemed to be slipping back to tolerable. Jake stumbled backward, his legs barely supporting him as he crashed into the wall. He slid down it, his back hitting the floor with a thud. The shadows twisted and danced in the corners of the room, their shapes shifting and changing, mocking him. He could feel them closing in, drawing nearer with every breath he took. "It's not over yet," the voice repeated, this time louder, clearer. "You've made your choice, Jake. Now you'll pay the price." His head vanished, the trauma causing the blood to swirl beneath his glasses. Jake's chest tightened. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He was trapped in this nightmare, and there was no escape. His eyes flicked to the pizza box once more, and a horrible realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He couldn't undo what had been done. He couldn't change the past. The moment he accepted that pizza, everything had shifted. The shadows were no longer just a presence in the corners of his mind. They were real. They were here, and they weren't going anywhere. The temperature in the room dropped again, colder than before, and Jake's breath turned to mist in front of him. He could hear the faintest scraping sound, like claws on the floor, slowly moving closer. His heart pounded in his chest, his throat tight with terror. He knew without a doubt that something was coming. Something worse than he had ever imagined. A dark shape moved in the shadows, a figure emerging from the gloom. Jake's eyes widened in horror as the delivery boy's form stepped into the dim light, his face twisted in that same grotesque smile. His eyes were hollow, lifeless, like two black voids that swallowed everything in their path. "You can't hide, Jake," the figure said, its voice low and rasping. "You can't escape. You've already made your choice, and now you'll pay the price for it." Jake scrambled to his feet, his heart racing as he backed away, but the figure followed, its footsteps slow and deliberate, echoing in the stillness. He couldn't run. There was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to close in on him, the air thick with dread. The shadows seemed to press in, pulling at him, dragging him down into the darkness. The delivery boy reached out, his cold fingers brushing against Jake's arm. A wave of icy dread surged through Jake's body, and for a moment, everything went black. When he opened his eyes again, he was no longer in his apartment. He was standing in the middle of a dark, empty street, the wind howling through the night. The world around him felt wrong, distorted, as if he had been pulled into some twisted reflection of reality. The figure stood before him, its smile wider than ever. Jake opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The world around him seemed to tilt, spinning faster and faster until he was swallowed by the darkness. Jake's mind swirled as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath ragged, but no matter how hard he tried to focus, everything felt wrong. The world around him shifted and twisted, as though reality itself had been unraveled. The street he stood on was eerily silent. The buildings were dark, their windows like empty eyes staring at him. The air was thick with an unnatural cold, and the wind carried a faint, distant whisper. The smell of something burning lingered in the air, but it was hard to tell where it was coming from. His eyes darted to the figure in front of him, the delivery boy. His grin stretched impossibly wide, and his hollow eyes bored into Jake's soul, draining him of every ounce of strength. "So, you're here now," the delivery boy said, his voice a low, rasping whisper that echoed through the empty street. "You're part of this place. Forever." Jake tried to move, to run, but his legs felt heavy, as if the very ground was holding him in place. His thoughts raced, trying to grasp at something, anything, that would explain what was happening. He had been trapped in this nightmare, dragged into a world he didn't understand. The pizza, the phone call, the shadows. It all made sense now. It wasn't just a curse, it was a trap. "Why me?" Jake managed to choke out, his voice barely a whisper. "Why did you choose me?" Jake snorted. The delivery boy's grin faltered, and for a moment his eyes seemed almost human. But then the darkness returned, consuming him again. "Ah, you chose this. You opened the door when you took the pizza. You invited me in. You invited them in." She stared at him. Jake's stomach churned. He remembered the feeling of that cold pizza box, the way the room had felt when he opened it, the sense of dread that had settled in his chest. The shadows, the whispers, they hadn't just been in his mind. They had been real. And now, there was no way out. The cold laugh echoed through the empty street. "There's no escape, Jake. You belong to this place now." Jake's chest tightened as panic surged through him. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The darkness was closing in, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. The street, the buildings, the air, everything felt like it was pulling him deeper into this nightmarish world. How did you... But then something unexpected happened. A soft light appeared in the distance, faint but undeniable. It was small at first, like the glow of a distant star, but it grew brighter as Jake's gaze fixed on it. His heart skipped a beat. Was this hope? Was this his way out? Without thinking, he took a step toward the light. The ground beneath him shifted, but he didn't stop. His legs moved on their own, as if some invisible force was pulling him toward the warmth, the safety he hoped for. The delivery boy reached out to stop him, but Jake was too fast. He ran, his feet pounding against the cold pavement, his heart racing. The light grew brighter with every step, until it filled his vision completely. And then, in an instant, everything changed. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he stumbled into the light. The world around him exploded in a burst of warmth, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the darkness receded. He found himself standing in his own apartment, the familiar sights and sounds of his home flooding his senses. The pizza box lay discarded on the floor, no longer ominous, but just an ordinary object. The shadows had vanished. The whispers were gone. The cold was gone. It was as if nothing had ever happened. Jake stood there, frozen in disbelief. He had escaped. He had somehow broken free from the nightmare. But as he looked around the room, a chilling realization began to settle in. Nobody had ever actually touched him apart from Martha. The phone on the table buzzed. His heart skipped a beat as he turned toward it. The screen lit up, displaying a message from an unknown number. His hands shook as he reached for it, the dread returning in full force. It took everything inside them to slowly turn. The message read, "It's not over yet, Jake. We'll be waiting." The screen flickered and went black. Jake's blood ran cold. He had thought he had escaped, but now he knew the truth. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. And somewhere, in the distance, he could hear the faintest whisper. "You can never escape us." The end.